in a way like animals, used in the most disgusting manner, many of them killed even before they got on the ships to be taken across, many of them killed on the ships itself, and then worked to death when they'd arrived the other side of the globe. Incredible inhumanity that capitalism was born through this system of blood and filth. That's the reality of how capitalism established itself, and Africa was the principal sufferer of that. Now, in order to move 13 million people across the globe, this required the capture of probably 21 million people in Africa, about 21 million people. And this is a time when the African population as a whole was some 50 million people. And therefore the shock of the slave trade upon Africa was massive, a massive shock that almost half of your population at any one time is dragged off into this system which removes them from being able to contribute to the development of your own society. And of course, in addition, the slave trade transformed African life itself. Who did it benefit? It benefited governments that were either immensely militaristic, who could therefore fight back against the slave traders, or who were prepared to act in concert with the slave traders, to enslave their own people, to deliver them over to the slave traders, and so on. And therefore, the impact of slavery was far greater than simply the human suffering. It transformed and altered and changed the whole way that African society existed. And with the end of slavery, despite the end of slavery, you very quickly come to the existence of colonialism. Colonialism which did not establish itself till very late, actually, in Africa, to the end of the 19th century. Before that, a long period of defeats for colonialism. But really from 1884 onwards, the Congress of Berlin, you see that five European colonialist countries, plus the King of the Belgians, the crazed King Leopold, divided up the whole of Africa between them, without any Africans being involved in this at all. They simply divided up the continent between the imperialist nations of the world. The drive of imperialism, the competition between nation-states defending and improving and encouraging their own capitalist firms, was what led to the enslavement of Africa even after the end of slavery. And the impact of colonialism was, of course, equally massive as that of slavery. That in the Congo, the one taken over by King Leopold of the Belgians, half the population was killed. Half the population worked to death in order to produce rubber for the markets of Europe. That in Tanganyika, the German colonialists deliberately killed 250,000 people through famine in order to prevent a rebellion breaking out against them. That the punitive expeditions of Lord Lugard, the filthy British imperialist in what is now Nigeria, man who would send out a punitive expedition. Their whole method was machine guns to kill people, to shoot people down, to return without any losses themselves, simply to remind the natives that they had better not rise against the British. This is the reality behind the pumping out of wealth that went on in Africa. And even when colonialism ended, after a huge struggle, at great cost, Africa was then thrown into the Cold War, where in order to carry out again the new type of imperialism, American interests in Central Africa, American interests in East Africa, the division of Africa between different imperialisms, led to puppet rulers like Mobutu being imposed in Zaire, which came after the Belgian Congo, and the bitter wars, as in Angola and in Mozambique, where people who had tried to achieve some sort of liberation from the system were hit hard by Western imperialism and its local client backers. And even when that phase had ended, you see that the newly independent countries did try and bring about some form of change in the interests of ordinary people, did try and do it, did try and achieve some form of development. We were very critical of the politics of lots of those people, very critical of the whole political path they trod, but did try and bring about some development of their societies on the basis of state leadership and so on. And yet very quickly they came up against the reality that they couldn't develop beyond a certain level. They came up against the reality of a bitterly hostile world system towards them. And therefore they turned to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund for assistance, for development loans, for aid, and so on. And for a period, the World Bank, particularly under Robert McNamara, who saw it as the role of how to carry out American imperialism in a new form, were very welcoming towards African states, very welcoming towards the notion they could take loans and they wouldn't be pushed to repay them very quickly and so on. Very swiftly, however, that altered. very swift economic policies of privatisation, of an end to subsidies, an end to welfare payments imposed with the structural adjustment programme. The structural adjustment programmes which pushed through to people the necessity of carrying out neoliberalism, as it would be called today, of market-driven economics, of rapaciously capitalist economics, in order not to have your whole of society pulled down by the withdrawal of the loans by the World Bank and the IMF. And the structural adjustment programmes have been utterly destructive for African countries. Let me take a very small example, the example of Mali in West Africa. Between 1960 and 1980, Mali, an extremely poor country, managed to reduce the level of infant mortality, one of the key indicators of health of any country, reduced the level of infant mortality by some 23%. It was still incredibly high, but between 1960 and 1980 they got it down by 23%. In the next 5 years, between 1980 and 1985, after the structural adjustment programme was imposed, the infant mortality rate rose by 26.5%. In other words, all the gains that they had desperately clawed themselves up to save some of their kids from dying before they got to the age of 1 were wiped out during the period of the structural adjustment programme. And in addition, these SAPs, just been renamed in order to avoid the bad publicity, poverty reduction programmes now, as they're called by the World Bank and the IMF. These were linked to the question of debt, linked very much to the notion that if you wanted more loans, if you wanted to have some sort of repayment holiday and so on, you had to carry out the notion of the structural adjustment programme. The level of debt, people again familiar with it. But Africa transferred to bankers and governments in the West £105 billion during the 1990s. And an incredible conjuring trick went on. An incredible conjuring trick. Between 1980 and 1996, Africa repaid twice as much as it borrowed. Twice as much. It gave back twice as much as it received from funding agencies and banks. And at the end of it, the debt was 3 times what it had been at the start. An incredible situation. They'd repaid it and repaid it and repaid it, and at the end it was much more. That was the reality. And it meant that the IMF and the World Bank were able to carry out an imperialist blackmail. They were able to say to people, if you don't carry out the way that we want you to run your economy, if you don't act in the interests of the giant corporations, if you try and have some form of alternative method of development, you will be crushed by the world system. We will crush you. We will prevent you having loans. We will prevent you having access to finance of any form. It's also true that whole swathes of the local leaders in Africa went along with this strategy. They went along with the belief that this was how you could develop. And they acted as the microcosm of the World Bank and the IMF within their particular countries. The various military regimes in Nigeria, Eyadema in Togo, Museveni in Uganda, Mobutu in Zaire. Could go through the examples of people who were brutal towards their own population in order, yes, to enrich themselves, in order to store up vast wealth and Swiss palaces and something on the French Riviera and something on the Côte d'Azur to return to when you eventually got kicked out, and Mobutu's personal hairdresser flown over from Paris twice a week. You know, all that sort of filth. But also to act in the interests of the giant corporations and the banks themselves, a coming together of an international ruling class and of its local variants, who were the ones, of course, who acted as the policemen of the system. It was them who shot down the strikers. It was them who bashed down the students when they revolted. It was them who put people in prison. It was them who prevented any growth of democracy inside those countries.